welcome back to WMMA Scene Now with your host Chuck Stevenson. So this is something that's going to be controversial. I wanted to talk about it, and you're welcome to chime in the comments. But it is going to be controversial. That's why I put the trigger warning at the beginning. But basically, this is going to be about how my argument that against all the people wanting to proclaim certain fighters as the greatest of all time, but my argument is that there is no greatest of all time, or if you want to abbreviate it, there is no GOAT in MMA, especially as it applies to the women's divisions. Now, I'm going to break this down as to, the causes. We're going to go over why why there's no real argument to be made for a GOAT in the women's divisions. And then finally, I'm going to break down certain fighters that people want to praise as the current GOAT, and I'm going to debunk all of them. So, yeah, so we'll get right down to it then, pretty much, okay? So, first off, why do so many people want to proclaim certain fighters as the GOAT? So, the causes. First, the most common one is hero worship, okay? Some fans basically worship fighters. They don't follow other sports. They only follow MMA. So they pick their favorite fighters and they basically worship them as like their heroes. Okay, and they need to espouse that their belief that their fighter is the best ever. And when I say their, I mean some of these people have claimed them as this is my fighter or my girl or whatever. I mean, some of these people are really obsessive. So to them, their fighter is their hero. The next cause, and these people to me are even worse because they're fake, is bandwagon syndrome. The bandwagon riders. Okay, these are fighters that a fighter's doing good, so these fans jump on their bandwagon. But then as soon as that fighter loses or looks even just a little bit less than dominant, they hop right off that bandwagon so fast and oftentimes pretend that they never were on the bandwagon to begin with. So their reasoning is that they need to prove that their current favorite fighter, they need to prove that fighter's greatness. Okay? And then the final cause of, the GOAT syndrome is MMA fan insecurity. Okay? Like I said, MMA is a new sport. It's the modern era of modern mixed martial arts. Once they really unified the rules, figured out and broke down the rules for it, and it stopped being no holds barred. That was like 20 years ago at the most. Okay, so the sport is new. A lot of fans are insecure about it, especially fans that are fans of MMA only and no other sport. And there are a lot of those fans. Okay, especially compared to other sports. I mean, granted, there are diehard sports fans of every sport. But MMA, because it's new and because it is kind of like a sport for, like, rejects, I want to say. I don't want to be mean about it because it is my favorite sport as well. Although I do follow some other sports. Not as much, though. But a lot of people, they need to say that, yeah, our sport has these people that are the greatest of all time. And then they can talk about it to, people that are arguing over LeBron versus Jordan in basketball, or Joe Montana versus Tom Brady in football, or whatever. So the three causes are hero worship, bandwagon syndrome, and MMA fan insecurity. Now, why don't most GOAT arguments for fighters hold? Okay, so going back, the UFC is 26 years old. It was founded in 1993. Now, it wasn't until the late 90s, early 2000s that really the established rule set that are common to most associations now were actually codified. In the U.S., New Jersey was the first one. Pride took them until a couple of years. It took them until like well past their 10th event, really, to figure out their own rules. And then most other organizations kind of followed after. Shudo had standing 8 counts well into the 2000s. Well into the 2000s. So the modern era of MMA, like the UFC is like 26 years old, but the modern era of MMA, once they really figured out how they wanted to go about doing this and make it a sport instead of a spectacle, is only about 20 years old. Okay? Now, when it comes to the ladies, before Strikeforce came around, ladies' fights outside Japan were few and far between. So we're talking pre-late 2000s. Ladies' fights outside Japan were very few and far between. Now, there were 2 all-women's events in the Midwest ran by Hook and Shoot. Hook and Shoot was a pioneer as far as that goes. They put on 2 different women's events, the Revolution events. But outside of that, Hook and Shoot didn't promote that many women's fights. Bodog did a tournament once with Hook and Shoot. But outside Japan, ladies' fights were very few and far between. They weren't organized. A lot of the time, it was the promoters getting 2 pretty girls together that had maybe trained a little bit and just have them go at it with each other. And then, even in Japan, at the time, the ladies were fighting under restrictive rules. Okay, the big one, the first all-women's promotion was in Japan. It was called Smack Girl. Now, they first started promoting under their remix events, and then they came into Smack Girl. And Smack Girl had no ground and pound to the head of, no punches or elbows to the head of a grounded opponent, and it had very limited ground time. You were only allowed about 30 seconds total on the ground. So they had very limited rules. Also, they had very short rounds. I believe they were only 3 minutes each. Okay, so then Smack Girl folded up and it split off. Valkyrie was founded and Jules was founded. Valkyrie basically picked up where Smack Girl left off. Jules became a little more like regular mixed martial arts. They went on beyond the 4 very limited weight classes that Smack Girl started with. And then, stateside, we had Elite XC tried with the women, but they again restricted the time for the women. They only had 3-minute rounds. That's stupid. I hated that part about them. And then really, Elite XC was only worried about pushing Gina Carano at the time. So then Strikeforce came around, and they established 2 divisions, bantamweight and featherweight, and that's what they went with. Around a little bit after that, Bellator came in, and they did a strawweight tournament. I think that was like the first time to really get the strawweights organized. And then along came Invicta on 28th April 2012, Invicta FC1. Invicta was the first promotion to give all of the really valid weight classes, the organized weight classes, a platform. Atomweight, strawweight, flyweight, bantamweight, and featherweight. So that was the first time that happened in stateside, and that was in 2012. So that was only 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 7 years ago. Only been 7 years. And that was before, really, the UFC had only started with it, with women's bantamweight. And then a couple years later, they did the strawweights. And then now they're trying to do it with featherweight, but not really. And then they finally opened flyweight in late 2017. Okay, so really, organized women's mixed martial arts is still in its relative infancy. I mean, a lot of the weight classes, especially like in the UFC, are still sorting themselves out. Especially flyweight. Flyweight's the newest one. It is still getting sorted out because it had an influx of fighters from both strawweight and bantamweight, because before that, you had fighters that were stuck in one of either 2 weight classes that were 20 pounds apart. All right, so right, as I said, the weight classes are still being sorted out, and it's multiple promotions now. So you have Invicta, you have UFC, you have Bellator, you have Deep Jewels in Japan, You have one championship has 2 divisions. Road FC in Korea is trying to build their women's divisions. They're mostly focusing on atomweight with a few fights in other divisions. Promotions in Europe have women's classes. So you've got all these women spread out everywhere. And the divisions are still, developing as far as figuring out what the pecking order is. All right? So, in conclusion, how can there be a greatest of all time or a GOAT given the timeline and general instability of the current women's divisions? So you tell me, how can there be a GOAT? All right, so let's look at some of the fighters that people want to proclaim as the greatest of all time. First up, Chris Cyborg. Not a GOAT. Sorry, guys. Her record has been extremely padded, and she is a known steroid cheat. Okay, she's only, out of her record is, I think, over 20 fights, only maybe 6 of them have not fought lower than featherweight. And of those, I think only 1 or 2 have a winning record. Then on top of that, she gets starched in less than a minute by the bantamweight, by a champion from a lower weight class. Sorry, not a GOAT. Next up, Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Not a GOAT. She might be the closest. She had the longest reign in her division in the UFC. She basically cleared out most of the top contenders. But then she goes and she gets clocked and, TKO'd in less than a round. Then she goes and loses the rematch. Then she goes up a weight class and loses a championship fight there. Now she's in limbo. We don't know what she's going to do. She seems to be sitting out waiting for another title shot that she hasn't really earned yet. So, Joanna, not a GOAT. Then we have her successor, Rose Namajunas. Definitely not a GOAT. Okay? She has no top 5 wins in her division outside of Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Yes, she knocked Joanna silly and TKO'd her in the first fight. And then she won a hotly contested rematch. But then, her first title defense outside of Joanna, she gets knocked out in the second round. She has no wins. She had no wins over the top 5 at the time of her title shot, and she has no wins over the current top 5 outside of Joanna. So she's not a GOAT. And then finally, we have everyone's current favorite bandwagon. I mean, most of this lady's fans right now are true bandwagon riders. Very definition of it. In fact, I was inspired to do this video by someone calling her the flyweight GOAT. Valentina Shevchenko. Not a GOAT, guys. I'm sorry. How can you call her the greatest of all time in a division that, one, the UFC has had for less than a year and is still a little over a year and a half now. They've had about a year and a half. It's still developing. 2, she's only had 3 fights. And 3, one of the first fight was against someone who had no business being in the UFC. Priscilla Cachoeira had no business being in the UFC at the time. She had no business being in the ring with Joanna Jędrzejczyk. And from her subsequent fights, you see she still has no business being in the UFC. She's not a UFC caliber fighter. 4, she won her championship against a former champion from a weight class lower that was moving up and fighting in at flyweight for the first time in, 4 years? 5 years. Like 5 years, basically, was the first time she had fought at flyweight. So you have 3 fights in the division. One was an extreme gimme fight, and the other was against someone from a lower weight class. But people want to proclaim her the greatest of all time. I'm sorry. Valentina Shevchenko has a long way to really prove her GOATness. Okay? She's got to clear out that whole division first, at least. All right, guys. That's it. That's my story. That's my idea. For now, I'm sticking to it. However, if you can make a logical argument for any fighter deserving to be called a greatest of all time in the women's divisions, I welcome your argument in the comments down below. In the meantime, likes are always appreciated. And what are you waiting for? Subscribe to WMAC Now, the best, fastest growing women's mixed martial arts dedicated platform on YouTube. And I'll be waiting for your replies.